If you remember a year ago, almost a little over a year ago, we talked about 2016 and how that it would be a year of anticipation. I don't know how many of you experienced that year in all of its anticipation, but when we look back on it, I think we can say there were a number of things that occurred that we couldn't have possibly anticipated. And that's kind of the way it is with the Lord. He'll tell you something, and it's clear as mud. And then after you go through it, you say, oh, that's what he was talking about. But he does that to help us. He does that to let us in on things because he wants us to be in on things. He's created us to have a destiny and a purpose. Every single one of us. Those of us who know him and those of us who don't. We all have a destiny. I think one of the things that has been trouble for us as Christians is that we spend a lot of our life coming to have an expectation in what the Lord will do with us and for us and through us. But we forget, we get so excited about that we forget that, you know what, everybody else has a destiny too. Everybody else, they're either finding it or losing it or not looking for it. I really believe that there are a lot of people that stumble into their God-given destiny and they don't even know the Lord. You know, you find people, and all of us have met people that they just seemed fitted for whatever they're doing. Just a natural thing. We find a lot more people, sometimes ourselves at different times of our life, that it's not fitting. You know, we're miserable, or we find comfort in the Lord, but not so much in the purposes in our lives. And so, I believe that 2017 is meant to be a year of change. For those things that we haven't known about him, those things that we haven't known about ourselves, that he wants us to know. I believe this is going to be a year where more of us, particularly in this country, discover who it is that we're meant to be in a much fuller way than ever before. And so as a kind of a continuation of the anticipation of last year, I hope you'll be in anticipation of this year, because it is going to be a year of change. I've been thinking about this. Of course, I've had a whole year. And so, you know, a lot of things cross your mind. Far too many to put into a Sunday morning lesson, although as you know from my history, I've tried to do that a few times. And sometimes I get out there and I don't find my way back. Kind of like this. I get out here in the crowd and I remember, oh, your notes are back there, buddy. but oh well. Couple of things. Along the way, you know, you're starting to resonate with something. Oh, okay, I want to be sure this is something I think that the Lord wants me to share when I have my opportunity. But you haven't figured out how that's all going to fall together in some kind of a comprehensible way that you can share in 20 to 30 minutes. Or more. But nevertheless, he's helped me it helps me to hear, to listen, more than just read and think. I probably should do more reading and thinking, but I'm one of those verbal processors, and so it kind of makes sense that I would hear something. I said, "Oh, that's part of what I want to say." Anyway, I came across a guy. I can't even remember his last name. His name was Neil, and he had written something on Elijah List. He was from New Zealand. I said, you know, that's very much along the lines of what I want to say. And then at the first part of December, my grandson and I left for China for 20 days. And I was kind of thinking the Lord might bring something to me in the travels that would add to what we're talking about this morning. And sure enough, the last 3 days of the trip, there's this fellowship that I often go to when I'm in Hong Kong. They're based out of New Zealand, second thing from New Zealand, but I love it because the worship is very much like ours, and so I kind of feel at home. And it's kind of like an oasis for me when I'm half the world away. So Nehemiah and I get on the subway. It took us a little longer to get there than I had anticipated. That hardly ever happens to me. And anyway, we walk in, the worship was over, and there was a guy with a big beard up front preaching. And, he had already started. He was in the middle of something. And the first thing I heard out of his mouth after we stepped into the auditorium, I said, he's preaching my sermon. So and sure enough, and somebody over here was praying, I'm sure, because I hadn't brought my notebook, so I couldn't take notes. So that meant that what I was going to bring back would be less than what it would have been, which is kind of God's mercy on you. But what I'm saying is I did get something, and I'm really excited about sharing this morning. You know, the Lord is interested in us as individuals, and when you travel around the world, you realize what a blessing America is. Because of our godly heritage, we value the individual. Sometimes too much. We get kind of egocentric in a lot of different ways, but every one of our soldiers, when he falls, we go get him. When they're captured, they're not forgotten. When you begin to see some things that are so deeply embedded in our hearts as Americans, when you see those things not happening, you realize that we're getting away from who we are as a people. We're not saying that our focus on individuals is better than any other country. But I will say that because of that, we have an opportunity to realize our identity in a way that almost nobody else on earth does. That's a blessing. And that's why when you're recruiting students from all over the world, but specifically Asia, you realize that why are they coming? Why do they want to come to America to study? Well, of course they want to learn English because that's the business language of the world. They want to come to America so they can get a good education, so they can get a good job. And that's a fine thing, but that's not really, if you ask them after they've been here about 6 months, well, is it everything you thought it would be? Or what's different about America than before you got here? They said, no. Every student I've ever asked that says one thing. It's the freedom. I can go to a 7-Eleven and I can buy whatever I want. I don't have to worry about somebody taking notes on what I'm doing. And I'm free. That seems like a little thing, but it sticks out in their mind. So many things that we take for granted that we've been given as a destiny as a people. And if you think you have nothing else to share with others, whether they're in America or any other place, that's one thing that you have that is unique in all the earth. And that is, in the eyes of God, you're important. You matter. And that you can make a difference with Him in the earth. Anyway, I think there are 3 main points I want to talk about this morning. One is that when you're into a big a year of change, a lot of things go into change when you're dealing with the Lord. I believe there's 3 things in particular that we can draw as we look at the nation of Israel, even before it was a nation. when it came time for them to be delivered out of Egypt and to become a nation, the birthing of Israel as a people, there were three things. One, there was God's timetable. Secondly, there was a full cup of iniquity which God was going to judge in their enslavement. And finally, you're going to have to wait because I've got to go back up to my notes. I can't remember what the third point is. Anyway, let's see. Yes. A cry for freedom. A cry for freedom. I hadn't really thought about a cry for freedom except in reading about it out of the Bible or history books, really until this fall. Carol and I had gotten invited to a prayer conference in Scotland, and it was like 6 months before. And I realized that how perfect that was, because when you're thinking of something 6 months ahead of time, you're not thinking of what the schedule is going to look like 6 months from now. Because if we had been invited a month ahead of time, we said, no way, can't get clear, too much stuff, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we go to this prayer conference, and we're the only Americans. There's 30 people there. It's out in the middle of nowhere in the Scottish Highlands, so there's almost no internet signals to get through, all that. We go through the prayer conference, and it was a great experience, but it was probably the people that were there that impacted us more than the teaching and all of that. So we're the only Americans. There's people there from 14 different nations. And they're all coming up to us, and they're asking us about the election. What do you think? We're praying. We're praying for America. These people are, they're prayer people, but they're like pastors, businessmen, nonprofits, but they're all certain kinds of leaders. They all have organizations around them. There was I guess the thing that stood out about all of us, they're all asking about America. They all had a very heavy burden for us. This was in October, so the election was only a month away. And they all told us that we're praying for America. And it became a little bit embarrassing, because I know that many of us were praying for the election and had a lot of concerns one way or another. But the other Christians in the world, they were crying out. They weren't praying for a particular candidate. They were praying for us, the people of America, that God would awaken the conscience of America. It was very humbling. I thought, what a blessing that other people that aren't even in this country, one, they look to us, but they care enough to cry out for us. To cry out and to feel a burden of the Lord. I haven't felt that all the time in my life. There have been a few times. I can actually very distinctly remember the first time I felt called to prayer and intercession. It was 47 years and 9 months ago. Now, how do I know that? Because that was when I saw my wife, my to-be wife, as my future wife. The first time I met Carol, which was about 4 years before that, a lot of you have heard this story, I was pledging a bunch of pledges in the cafeteria at college. And, you do some make them do something stupid or whatever. And Carol saw me running these guys through the drill. I think they were eating a square meal or something, kind of dumb. But she came up and she said, I don't think you're being a Christian by acting that way. And I said, you need to mind your own business. And that was our meeting. That's how it all started. And so I guess I could say over the next 4 years, we had a kind of adversarial relationship with many different episodes, which I won't go into, but take my word for it. Well, then there was a big crisis in both of our senior years. And I say that because we didn't start at the same time. She started a year after I did. But I took me 5 years to do what she did in 4. And that should have been a clue to me, I guess, but it wasn't. Anyway, we ended up being on the campus was completely evacuated. And we were the only students there. There were reasons for that. Probably ones I didn't see at the time, but at any rate, so we'd sit and talk. There were a lot of things to talk about, I guess, and I always opened my conversation with most girls that I thought were pretty. So when you get married, how many children you want to have? That's a real divider of the way, let me tell you. But I was always curious. It just seemed like a good question to ask. And, of course, appropriateness was not one of my great attributes. I've gotten a little better, but anyway. So we get into different conversations. And there was a day we came out and we sat down, started talking. I felt like I heard the Lord said, this is going to be your wife. And I said, oh, wow. Holy, it wasn't spirit. And I said, so have you told her that? He says, no, I'm leaving that up to you. And so that's when my intercessory life began. A lot of prayer in a short period of time. And I went through a lot of changes, and so did she. But here we are. On the 27th this week, we had our 47th anniversary. Yeah. But I'm saying that because that was something in God's timetable. All of us have those kind of experiences. We don't always see them at that moment. A lot of times we're looking back on them. You know what I'm saying? And I've got to say, that was a big moment for me, but I didn't see it as a 47-year moment. You know what I'm saying? Now it's clear as a bell. But at the time, all I remember is I was scared to death. And that I knew that this was going to take more than my good looks. So truly, we have a miraculous God. Anyway, my point is that when Israel got ready, or they didn't know they were ready, but when God got ready for them to be delivered, he had spoken about this long before, that the day would come. When he spoke to Abram, he said, look, there'll be a time. We got those scriptures, Wes, a couple of them. Yeah, then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. It says that Abram came to the promised land. He was a wanderer and he lived in tents. But God told him, no, this is your land. But the time is not yet. You're going to become a mighty people. Remember, God was saying this to Abram when he didn't have a kid and he was over 90 years old. And it was tough to believe that. But God was true to his word. And in his time, actually 430 years later, it was time for them to come out. God does that. He speaks to nations as well as individuals. And he's speaking to America now. 2017 is a watershed year. And it will be a year of change. The issue will be, will we see it for what it is? And because as you notice, there are some things God leaves to us. There are some things that he gives to you free. There are other things that he gives to you, but I'm leaving part of this to you. Because to accomplish my will on the earth, you are a part of that. You have a destiny. And so does your church, and so does your state and your city and your nation. Most of us just don't think of it that way. What's a blessing is that when we know ahead of time, if we can believe it, we align ourselves with the things that he's speaking from heaven, and we begin to speak the same things. So, number one about 2017 is a year of change. It's in God's timetable. I wrote a poem about this. Finished it yesterday. It's called God's Big Clock. You want to put it up there, Wes? Good, thanks. The time has come on God's big clock when words declared move past mere talk. When vessels waiting at the dock are launched on journeys past all thought. The waves and winds, which once were fierce, now serve to shred the veil of fear. Beyond, a new horizon breaks as prows of faith create love's wakes. It's time. Point one, it's time. Secondly, the thing that occurred with Israel at this point was, and God made mention of this, the cup of iniquity was full. You know, a lot of times when we think about our destiny, we don't recognize and remember everybody else has a destiny too. And sometimes we get so into what we call Christian triumphalism, like, oh, we're going to win, we're going to be on top, everybody else is a loser. I mean, we may not say that, but because we only consider ourselves, what do other people get from that? They get self-righteousness is what they get. And they don't want anything to do with us or our God. Because we forget, we get so wrapped up in the blessing that we have that we forget that, hey, they have a destiny as well that God has given them. So I guess one of the things that we want to remember that when things need to be made right, God is really patient. He allows the cup to be full. Why does he do that? Because he has mercy on people. He gives them every chance to turn. And if that still doesn't happen, then he makes it very clear that, no, this isn't the way it's going to be. And that's what happened with the peoples of the Promised Land, and that's what happened with Egypt. After 430 years of keeping people in slavery and the people crying out to the Lord, it says God heard the cries and he remembered his promise. And he brought them out of Egypt. And we all know the story of what happened with the Egyptians. But you know what? They have a destiny too. And if you look at the history of Egypt and where they are today, there's an amazing amount of Christians in Egypt that are suffering from all kinds of sources, primarily people that have a different faith that persecute them. But there is a very strong, probably one of the strongest underground churches in the world in Egypt today. Because God hasn't forgotten the Egyptians either. And he won't. I used to, as an example of how we've got to anticipate our success and not be so caught up in it that we can't see that, okay, there are other people that maybe they're not having the same success and they can't see their way clear to come to the Lord. A lot of reasons. But my point would be this. I used to teach a class in high school, Christian high school, called Christian Issues. And it was about just dealing with common social things like abortion. Well, some of the kids have deep convictions, of course, about abortion. And some would offer up in the class discussion, well, if you've had an abortion, you're a murderer. I said, well, wait a minute. Let's think about this. Let's be careful about what we say. We may feel very strongly about the sanctity of children. But maybe everybody doesn't see it that way. Maybe they can't get there from where they are right now. Maybe they're under so much pressure that they've never even thought about that that's a life within them. But I'm willing to bet that in this classroom, let's say there were 20 kids, I'd say there's more than one person here who, since you're in high school, it's unlikely you've had an abortion, but it's possible. But I'm willing to bet several of you have someone very close to you who's had an abortion. Maybe your sister, or maybe a close friend, or a friend of a friend. Would you call them a murderer? Probably not. How do you think the people that have a sister who's had an abortion feel when you say people who have abortions are a murderer? Is that going to make it any easier for them to hear the Lord? You see, part of being, quote, successful or victorious or overcoming or becoming who we are in Christ, everybody else has that same struggle, and some of them aren't finding their way. Do you want to make it harder for them? Or do you want to make it easier for them? So part of coming into a time of change is, it's not always just what happens, it's how it happens. If you notice through the Bible, there are a lot of different things that occur that you might think, oh, wow, that's terrible. Maybe it was. But how was it handled? That's the answer when Jesus protected the woman caught in adultery. He basically turned it back to everybody who's had a rock in their hand and said, hey, let the first innocent guy throw the first rock. And everybody dropped the rocks and walked away. We want to be a people that as we change and as we move forward in our identity, that we don't just throw dust on everybody else and make it harder for them to find theirs. You don't want to gloat in your victory. You want to reflect the Lord in Him. And that's, honestly, it's hard for us as humans to do that. It is. That's just basic humanity. That, yeah, we get fired up when something good happens, and you want to be able to rejoice. But you want to remember that everybody isn't rejoicing. They're not getting it. So when we talk about change, how do we do that without making people feel bad, hurting their feelings? Well, that's why we pray. That's why we draw closer to the Lord, because the closer you get to Him, the more you talk with Him, He rubs off on you, and you get His heart. You get His heart. Not just your theology. A wise man once said that what did he say? He said, the mind justifies what the heart has chosen. We choose a lot more than we think out of our heart, but then we use our mind to justify, you know what I'm saying? That's why the greatest gift that God ever gave us, and if you actually want to have a good life, you learn to receive his forgiveness, and you learn to forgive others. If you can be the greatest Christian example in the world, but if you can't forgive somebody, or you can't receive God's forgiveness, you're going to be miserable. You get to live with whatever you want to hang on to that you're bitter about. You get to carry that around all the time. You may be right, but you're not righteous. And that's the difference. It really is. Which brings us, so the cup got full. God judged that. I'd like to believe that some of the things that were going on in our country, which none of us are really happy about, I think we have a chance to change some of those things. I believe God will help us, but he's not going to do it for us. He will do it with us. We've got to trust him that he will help us. So when we say 2017, the year of change, yeah, there will be different circumstances, but will there be different people? Will we change? Will we receive what he has for us? Third thing, let's see, I stumbled on this twice now, but that's crying out. Crying out. I said, we kind of experienced that just coming back from Scotland, becoming aware. I have a good friend who's a missionary in Hong Kong, and he works for an organization called Every Home for Christ. Many of you probably haven't heard of it, but it's a huge organization of intercession, prayer, and gospel literature distribution. They have over 1 million people a year that come to the Lord through their ministry. And again, most of us have never heard of them. Well, they've got 8,000 employees all over the world and 60,000 volunteers, plus anybody else that's, working with them on projects and stuff like that. That organization, Curtis told me, he said, our whole organization is fasting and praying for 40 days before the election. And again, what we're praying is God awaken the conscience of America. That's humbling. 40 days fast. You've got to have some kind of conviction to do that. Not easy. But crying out to God. Carol and I had an interesting thing coming out of that conference. And it's, I know at least for us personally, we were really affected. We didn't have time to take a vacation in England or anything like that. We were always, it was an 8-day conference. It was 1 day in, 8 days, 1 day out. So you'd like to see some part of the world you've never been to, right? So we're in Aberdeen, Scotland, where our flight goes out the next morning. And we heard about an English garden that was one of the best in the empire. So we went over to see it. It took about 20 minutes for me to see everything that I could possibly absorb in an English garden. But there was about 15 minutes left in the day that this museum was open. We didn't even know what the museum was about. So I said to Carol, why don't we, we'll see what we can see in this museum. Well, it happened to be the Museum of the Scottish Highlanders. They were originally called the Gordon Highlanders, and they were formed by a Scottish lord, Gordon, who owned half of Scotland at the time. And he had all these tenant farmers on it, primarily Christian families. And the king, or the queen, I guess it was the queen, asked if he'd form up a troop of soldiers to help the empire. So he did. They offered 1 English pound and a kiss from Lady Gordon to sign up. So these guys formed this unit, and they became the most decorated unit in the British Empire. And so this museum was about the exploits of the Gordon Highlanders. Well, we didn't know all this. We walked in, and it was one of these self-guided tours. And from the moment we stepped into this place, we were overcome. We began to weep. So one of the tour guides saw this, and she said, look, you won't have enough time to see the whole thing before closing. Let me give you a personal tour. She had a son in Iraq, and her grandfather was one of the Gordon Highlanders. And I guess she saw we were moved, and anyway, so we began to go around this from one exhibit to another, and we couldn't stop weeping. It was like we were in the presence of the Lord. And the stories of valor, heroism, men sacrificing their lives, were just breaking. And we came to one, there was a big painting, and it was Queen Victoria. She was giving a Victoria Cross to a soldier. And he was standing at attention, and he was blind. And Queen Victoria was on her knees, weeping and holding up this Victoria Cross. I couldn't handle it. Anyway, we left that place, and ever since, the things that have moved me slightly before, I embarrassingly start crying. And, you get into prayer about some things, and you start crying. It was a catalytic moment for us in that way to be moved by the Spirit of the Lord over people we had never met, but the God-given valor and courage and sacrifice of one generation after another of laying down their lives, Christian men. I say that because Israel cried out to God. He heard their cries. I know all of you at different times in your life have experienced something like that. Maybe at the passing of a loved one, at the joy of childbirth, at great times where you were devastated or you were encouraged. Generally, those things bring change. And I believe that 2017, when we say it's a year of change, I think that many of you will feel called deeply about the things around you. I don't know that it matters so much what it is. God knows the things that touch the deepest part of your heart. And I guess what I'm saying is, let it. Let it. Because in that, He will change you. He will change you in a way that you need to be changed. I think one of the greatest fears we have right now, if you work with young people, is that you see the electronics. It's taken the heart away from a generation. They don't know how to relate, to talk to somebody in the face. They might text them, but most of the boys especially, most of them are addicted to the video things, and they're removed. It's like in an electronic universe. The whole humanity the heart is getting cut out of a generation. It's tragic. Some of you may be moved to cry out for that. Seems innocent, but it's not. It's insidious. It's tearing us away from our link with God. God isn't a machine. God is a person. You know Him. If you don't, you'll want to. you'll want to. So those three things about change in 2017. I believe this. I believe that we're going to see, even in this church, we're going to see not one or two people come to the altar to surrender their lives. We're going to see scores more than we've ever seen before, because God is at work in America. God is at work in America, and it's on his timetable for us to wake up. To wake up. We're going to see deliverance. Many of us have gotten stale in our faith. There are things not only currently that we're very aware of that we want to be rid of, but there are some things that we have kept deep down in our past that still drag us down and keep us confined. Heartaches, bitterness, depression. This is a year of change. We're going to have an invitation. I'm going to ask the musicians to come. We're going to play Amazing Grace because we all recognize our need for that amazing grace. The communion table is set, and if you wish, I'm going to ask you not to come down the middle aisle. I'm going to ask you to go down the side and go there. I want you to, as you will, deal with the Lord and taking communion. But if you're a person here that's never surrendered to the Lord, and anything that's been said today, or maybe something you carried coming in here, you recognize that, yeah, this is a new year, and you're here on New Year's Day, because this is a good time for a new beginning. I'm going to invite you to come down while they're playing, and we'll pray with you. If you're a Christian and you maybe haven't cried out to the Lord in a while, and you realize that you need a fresh touch of the Lord, I'm going to ask you to come down and let us pray for you. And if you're totally fine and you want to spend some time with the Lord at the table, then do so as well. So let's stand together.